Today. Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast as you're driving along in your car or your truck or in public transport. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of food and grocery price gouging and profiteering or excessive profiteering that's being pushed now by Democrat politicians in the United States. They're talking that they're going to take tough action. They're going to have market controls and price controls and all sorts of controls, and that'll fix it. And as well as giving $25,000 subsidies to people to buy houses. Now, price fixing and price rigging and market fixing, price and income controls. Many governments, whether they be communist or even other governments during times of, say, higher inflation, this is always a very tempting sort of device or series of devices to control the prices. And so, but if price controls are introduced, then you have to also have income controls, and then it has a cascading effect, and many other controls are needed. And before you know it, you're talking about central planning. Now, the central planning in the Soviet Union, or any communist country for that matter, never actually worked. Its intention was, I suppose, reasonable enough. The idea that we can distribute resources more effectively and to where they're really needed if we have central bureaucratic control, whereas the market creates distortions, aberrations, but also it creates unusually high profits for certain people within or certain organizations or groups within the wider process of food production, food gathering, food distribution, food selling, or whatever. So this idea that bureaucrats will not allow profit to accumulate in any one place or one area means that it's automatically more equitable. Now, again, on a purely technical ideological basis, that doesn't seem unreasonable. But one thing that intrigued me at traveling to, again, I reiterate, for many years I did a huge amount of business traveling and going to socialist and semi-communist countries and third world countries, all sorts of different places. The ability to get full shelves or shelves full of groceries in grocery stores and supermarkets, that's something that only Western countries were ever, capitalist countries were ever able to do. And the idea of you had to queue for basics such as bread and milk and so on. This is more in the cities, not necessarily in the rural areas, but this was a standard thing. So you're standing for an hour plus, sometimes more than an hour, just to get a loaf of bread in, say, the Soviet Union for most of the year was just how it was. That you could, now if you had good connections and you were up the ideological, excuse the pun, food chain, you're a good ideological fanatic, then you would have access to better shops that did have fully stocked shelves. But there weren't many of those, and you had to be at the apex of the ideological sort of fervor of things to have access. So these things never really worked. So let's come back to the idea of price gouging. Now, the headline evidence for price gouging is pretty formidable. The price of bread and milk and various other, pretty staple stuff like entry level beef mince or ground beef. That's the prices have gone up by 50% plus. Now, this is sort of since the globalist enforced pandemic. So now other things have gone up, have doubled in price. Things like processed food, like certain brands of sausages, for example, have doubled in price, and other things have doubled in price. There's things that haven't gone up too much, like, say, chicken, for example, has gone up by 20 to 25%, that sort of thing. So it's not uniform, but the basics, again, bread and milk, you can't get much more basic than that. They've gone up by 50% or more. And if you want to look at the more luxurious types of bread, then they've gone up again even more than that. They have doubled in a number of instances. So what was the cause of the doubling? Now, the claim was that supply chains broke down. Okay, let's look at that. Supply chains broke down because of the pandemic. Now, remember, the pandemic was forced on us. This wasn't some natural organic event. It was forced on us. So the pandemic was supposedly disrupted supply chains. Now, if we accept that, then we would look at, say, countries where they have to import a vast amount of their food. They would be particularly affected, whereas countries that are close to self-sufficient in food production wouldn't be affected because there's no supply chain factor involved. The food's all grown and so on locally anyway. So if you look at, say, places like Australia that have a very high proportion of locally produced food and not much in the way of processed food, or supply chain vulnerable food. Now, there are supply chain vulnerable items, particularly things like imported chocolate or something like that. But in regard to milk, bread, those sorts of things, beef, chicken, lamb, and so many other things, vegetables, fruit, all of that is, well, not all of it, but nearly all of it is grown in Australia. So there was no supply chains to disrupt, unless you want to talk about the supply chain from 100 miles down the road to the city or something like that. So when we look at the supply chain argument, it doesn't stack up, because the price increases in Australia have gone up about the same as they have in countries that have a very high proportion of food imports. So the supply chain thing, no, that doesn't wash. Otherwise, there would be big differences. Heavily supply chain dependent countries would be disrupted in terms of not only supply but price, and countries with very low dependency on supply chains would be largely unaffected by price. So supply chains aren't it. That's bullshit. That is absolute and total bullshit. Now, there are some areas. So, for example, where, say, I don't know, say a certain fruit or vegetable that's grown in Australia, that may be sent offshore to be processed and put in cans and then brought back to Australia. That would be an area that would be, but those areas, the price changes there weren't as severe as they were in the basics of bread and milk, which is all local. So the idea that Australian grown wheat is then sent offshore and then the fresh bread's delivered back, that doesn't happen. The fresh bread's baked here in Australia. So now, there are some processing issues where the wheat may be sent offshore and then processed into a baseline dough and then brought back. There are issues, but that's not how the whole thing works. So again, supply chains we can dismiss. So then the next claim was that the pandemic disrupted labour supply. Because people had to get jabs or this or that, and therefore there was an acute shortage of workers, and this meant that the factories couldn't run and so on. That's bullshit too. That just didn't happen. Then there was another claim where shortage of workers meant that there weren't enough drivers to, the trucks that would deliver 20 tons of groceries to the grocery store. They couldn't get drivers for those trucks, so the deliveries couldn't play. That too was bullshit, absolute bullshit. There were plenty of workers there and plenty of people available. Some companies had such severe jab policies that they inflicted. It was just absurd and ridiculous self-inflicted wounds there. But that was not a decisive issue. Then there were claims that the cost of labour went up to such an extent, because of the supposed shortage of labour, went up to such an extent that labour costs blew the lid off things, and so prices had to be increased because of labour costs. That too is bullshit. If you look at the cost of labour, in these places. It increased by a fraction of a percent, a small fraction, nothing like the price increases that were. So that's also not an issue. Another issue was because of supply chains. Oil couldn't get delivered, and processed oil into petroleum or gasoline in the American parlance couldn't be delivered, and therefore none of the trucks and vehicles could move because there's no oil, or ruinous, huge extortionate prices had to be paid for oil. And this therefore was that too is bullshit. If you sit down and do the spreadsheet mathematics, that's absolute crap. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the labour cost increased by a small amount, and there are other on costs such as maybe the supply chains become slightly more expensive because of, or deliveries. A supply chain suggests something international, but the ability to move something from A to B, even if it's domestically or internationally, but because of the price of oil increased, that there was okay. So let's accept that. Now, even if we're just over the moon generous in terms of additional costs are imposed through oil and labour and this sort of thing, then again, hugely generous, will say that the cost of manufacturing or getting the product to the grocery store shelves increased prices by 10%. Increased costs rather by 10%. Let's assume, again, being very generous here, I don't believe it was that much. I suppose it depends on how you do the mathematics, but whether you pick a low point to jump from or a high point in previous costs, production costs. But if we come to now, then getting it to the grocery store. Now, the price increase to the grocery store, again, assuming we allow 10% in increased production costs, then we have the relativity of profit margin. Let's say 15% would be a justified increase at the cost on the supermarket shelf. Then that would have dissipated because oil would have gone up and down in price. Do they up and down the price of groceries every time the oil price moves? They don't. So that's not a realistic look at that. The labour cost then started to come down after the supply chains were back in, and then the mass migration began again after the pandemic ended. And in most countries, they were aggressively attempting to make up for the mass migration that did not occur during the pandemic, and then to double or triple the migration numbers as they're doing in Australia to make up for that lost couple of years of mass migration. The globalists, you've got your budget for black and brown people, so damn well get back to get back to work and make sure you double the intake of illiterate peasants from the third world. So anyway, then we got the mass work. So the labour price started to come down. So not that it went up that much, if at all, but it did start to come down. So in the overall scheme of things, prices should have fallen back somewhat. Let's assume they haven't, and I don't think they have. So we've got to account for price increase of somewhere between 35%. This is at the retail level, somewhere between 35 to say high 30%. Let's just concede to 10%. That's okay. Okay, you have that. So it's still here. So bread that I could buy for $3 before the pandemic is now $4.80, and at worst it should be even again allowing for, it should be maybe $3.60 at the top end of the range there, for assuming again being generous with the increased cost of production. So somehow there's $1.20. $1.30, and this is over the $4.80. So that's unaccounted for. So where is that profit gone? So is this the price gouging they're talking about? Now let's have a look at the profits of the company, the bakery that does this bread, or the companies that distribute the milk, for example. And we don't see their profits have really altered that much. Instead of sort of 4%, they're getting 4.9%, say. So now, bear in mind that most of these firms that own milk production in Australia and are multinational owned, so they can distribute profits internationally around, and they can impose managerial fees from a head office that damp profits down. But so where has that money gone? The supermarkets aren't making it. The supermarkets in Australia, because it's such an oligopoly, the profits here are unusually high. So say they're 2 to 3% in somewhere like the United States, and in Australia they're like 5 or 6%. This is for the supermarket chains or grocery store chains. So again, that's not where the difference is. It's not there. We're only chasing three at best 4 cents on the dollar at the outside. So that's not a material factor in anything. We look at the transport companies; they've got some more like increased price of oil and so on. So you could add a little bit in there maybe, but you're still talking about 20%, 20 to 30% or more profit or increase in price that's unaccounted for. Where has that gone? Because it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. You look at any component in the process, and none of them are recording profits any significantly higher or noticeably different from what it was before the pandemic. So that increase in price on the shelf has gone somewhere, but it's not obvious where it's gone. Now, in the case of, say, monopoly or oligopolies, these sorts of things, supposedly the antitrust and the the anti-competitive protection laws, this sort of thing, is meant to stop this sort of thing. But since the globalists have taken over the Western governments, there's no sovereign Western government anymore, then this idea of preventing monopolies and oligopolies has really stopped. But we need to look at where an oligopoly occurs or a monopoly occurs. So a monopoly, we've got this view: monopoly occurs at the level of production or at the level of retail. So that, for example, if there's only one grocery stores in the whole of the country where you could buy your groceries, that'd be monopoly. There's no competition. You can't go anywhere else. Or if there was only one manufacturer of groceries in the country, then the grocery stores, no matter how many there were, they couldn't go anywhere else to get their groceries, as in from the point of manufacture. So that would be a monopoly. Or an oligopoly event. There's only 2 or 3 players. Now, there's a lot of oligopolies in there, or cartels. Now, there could be, say, 5 manufacturers of I don't know, cooking sauce, for example. Just I'm picking something off the top of my head here. The 5 manufacturers of cooking sauce. So that's not a monopoly because there's 5 of them. Is an oligopoly. Oligopoly typically means sort of 3. So 5, but they've all got pretty much the same price for their products, even though there are 5 different manufacturers supposedly represented on the grocery store shelves. They're pretty much all the same price. Now, some of them are in different sizes or different packaging. This one's got 1 kilogram, and these guys only sell half kilograms. So you get those type of things. But how come their prices are? How come all their prices went up at the same time in the same amount? That's not market driven. That's not supply and demand. Nothing like it, in fact. So, but there is no monopoly here. So if we go back through the if you like, the chain of ownership, we find that the BlackRocks and the State Streets and the Vanguards, they own all of those companies, or have majority shares, maybe not every single share, but they hold a majority of shares in all of those. So the cartel or the oligopoly or even the monopoly in the case of William BlackRock, and they own most of the shares, that's controlled by a small group of financial houses who are supposedly representing millions and gazillions of, say, like retirement savings and investment holdings and so on. But their power to decide what these companies will and won't do is almost is almost absolute. They can decide who is going to be on the board of directors, how much they're going to do DEI policies, diversity policies, how much affirmative action, how many black lesbians they're going to have in senior management. These businesses can decide and impose terms, conditions, and even profit margins. We want you to make this much. We want you to do this. We want you to do that. So the control is almost close to total. The CEO will be a stooge controlled by these firms, and will be richly rewarded for doing as they're told. So they'll just develop criteria for triggering huge bonuses. If the share price reaches X, you'll get a gazillion dollar bonus. Now, because these three firms, or could be a few more of them, but a clutch of these firms own all the shares, and they work in collusion like a wolf pack, then they can round robin share purchasing and churn and burn, the shares back and forth amongst themselves, walk the price up to whatever price they want, which then triggers a huge bonus. So the CEO can never need to work again if they do what they're told. And why would you fight that? If the CEO, like the short-term Prime Minister of Britain, Liz Truss, if you fight that, you'll be out of a job in 5 minutes, and you'll never get another job again. The word will go out that you're a troublemaker. He can't be relied on. We want only good little globalists for our, and so on. So really, now once you've got this extra profit, it's not hard to bury that profit in moving money around offshore, in management fees, stacking it up heavily with loans and high interest rates, and this and that, and so on. So it's not hard to bury and burn that money, so it doesn't appear as a increase in profit, or you add super extra costs to the company. So even though it's got all this extra profit coming in the door from the extra prices it can now charge at to the groceries chains, that profit is just spirited away with all these imaginative additional costs and so on. So this is real, or they move production overseas or something like that. But this is the situation we're in. So have prices gone up? Yes, they have. No question of that. They're absolutely out there for all to see. But they've gone up uniformly to the same percentage and extent all across the world, regardless of supply, demand, local production, whether it's all imported and so on. So we can see this is a coordinated, choreographed, planned, centrally planned thing that's happening. So to what extent is supply and demand determining prices on the essentials of life, whether it be electricity or water or housing or food? Well, it doesn't anymore. Supply and demand has no effect on these things. The essentials of life are all completely controlled by the globalist cabal. They are determining the price. They are determining what we'll pay. And you'll note that the prices of rent relative to incomes in the country are all pretty much the same all across the Western world. You can't get that sort of uniformity in if natural market, organic supply demand market forces. Well, you just don't get it that way. But this is how it is going on, which again indicates quite clearly it's centrally controlled. Now, in areas where the globalists don't have central control, in some areas of electronics, the non-essential, the optional consumer goods of life, motor vehicles, things like that then you're looking at wherever you have a lot of real market competition. Now, the competition may not necessarily just be on price. It may be on features. We'll give you, top of the range air conditioning for your car for no extra cost. There can be those sorts of features, benefits type competition. But the reality is that outside of optional consumer goods, in the world and in the West today, there is no competition. Now, you may say, well, look, there is plenty of competition at the retail level. Look at all the corner grocery stores. There are gazillions of corner grocery. See, look at all the competition. But that's not the reality here. The products they have to sell are controlled by ultimately a very small group of, again, the BlackRock type thing, and they are running it as a, I would argue, in my opinion, they're running it as a cartel, which is why you get such incredible A, price increases, and B, uniformity, regardless of what market circumstances may or may not be. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.